Welcome into the Tech Ed Podcast. I am Matt Kirkner, your host. This and every week we have yet another fantastic guest joining us to talk all about manufacturing, all about technical education, all about the Midwest, the future of manufacturing in the Midwest and around the globe. It is going to be a great conversation with Mr. Tim Sullivan. Tim is the former Chief Executive Officer of Bucyrus International, a truly iconic manufacturer in the state of Wisconsin and around the globe. Today, he serves as the chairman of the Bucyrus Foundation, an organization which is doing some great things inside and outside of technical education. Welcome to the Tech Ed Podcast, where we visit with leaders who are shaping, innovating, and disrupting technical education. People who are not afraid to think differently, not afraid to try something new, all with the goal of securing the American dream for the next generation of STEM and workforce talent. Tim, thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Glad to be here.
Let's start with your hometown of the city of Milwaukee, my hometown as well. You brought the Rev Group's headquarters here from Orlando when you were leading that company. You influenced Gardner Denver's headquarters move to Milwaukee several years ago. And as we all know, you led Bucyrus International, a Milwaukee area company, for years. What is it, Tim, about the Midwest and specifically about the city of Milwaukee that prompted you to encourage these organizations to move here and was such a great part of the legacy of Bucyrus International?
Well, it's very interesting. You know, the state of Wisconsin on a per capita basis is still the largest manufacturing state in the United States. And people lose track of that because, over time, we've lost a lot of large manufacturing companies here in southeastern Wisconsin in particular, but across the state. But we're still number one, and that's a big deal. Milwaukee used to be number one. We're actually, the last statistics that I saw, we're now number two behind San Jose, California, which is interesting. But, when I looked at manufacturing companies, and as you mentioned, Gardner Denver was based in Philadelphia when I took it over, and Rev was based in Orlando, Florida. And, everyone says, well, it doesn't really matter where the headquarters of a manufacturing company really is because, the administrative functions of any company are very similar. That's just not true. And I think what's interesting, and I found this over time, both with Gardner Denver and Rev, if you have an accountant that comes from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, that's been trained in the manufacturing industries of the area, they're different than someone that we had in Orlando that was more based in the entertainment industries or the food processing industries, that type of thing. It's just not the same. Even healthcare is just a little bit different. So the administrative functions of a manufacturing company tend to have specialities. And I think that those specialities kind of work their way into the day-to-day operations in a different way. So I saw it when we brought Gardner Denver back here from Philadelphia, and I saw it again when we brought Rev back. It creates a much more cohesive approach to the manufacturing processes of a company if the base of operations, both administratively and operationally, are based in the Midwest.
It's interesting. I reflect on that answer you just gave and thinking about it's just the manufacturing centric culture that we have here in the Midwest, here in the city of Milwaukee. I guess in some ways you take it for granted, or at least I did. I grew up in and around manufacturing. I ran manufacturing companies for 20 years. And I guess you just assume that people that come into those organizations know manufacturing because so many of them do because of all the manufacturing that takes place here in Milwaukee. I also found it's interesting that you mentioned San Jose on a per capita basis having more manufacturing than the city of Milwaukee. Is that around technology, semiconductors, and so on, or what's driving that?
It's everything. Actually, when I had a company for a short period of time in the paper industry, very short period of time, we had a fairly large manufacturing facility in San Jose. If you go to the San Jose area, the industrial parks there are quite large, and there is a lot of metal bending type manufacturing in San Jose. It's kind of a misnomer. Everyone thinks it's all about, .coms and, semiconductors and that sort of thing. And it is, but there's a lot more there than meets the eye.
I used to spend some time out there years ago. I ran a company that manufactured RFID radio frequency identification products. And obviously with all of the technology out in San Jose and San Francisco and the Bay Area and so on, spent some time out there back then, but I guess I never really did think about all the traditional manufacturing that goes into supporting organizations and in markets like that and others. So interesting that they've got the jump on Milwaukee. We're looking forward to maintaining a really strong manufacturing environment here in our city. Speaking again on the manufacturing topic, you mentioned the Rev Group, so did I, manufacturers of specialty vehicles like ambulances, buses, sweepers, recreational vehicles. Gardner, Denver, for our audience members who may not know, provides engineered vacuum systems and air blowers. Bucyrus, later acquired by Caterpillar, was surface and underground mining equipment. You made a long and successful career, Tim, out of leading manufacturing companies. I'd be interested in your thoughts now on the future of manufacturing here in the United States. Is it a bright one?
Brighter than it used to be. And it's interesting how that morphed, because if you go back 2 decades ago, I'll call it the aughts, back in that period of time, and even probably in the late 1990s, a lot of manufacturing was being moved elsewhere. So I remember back in the 90s, companies were looking at Korea as a manufacturing base, and then that morphed into becoming China. And, they were always looking for the lower cost labor location. And everyone thought, boy, you really have to do that. That's where you should go. We never did. And there was a very good reason why. We did the analysis. And if you look at the labor content of a manufactured component, the direct labor content is probably somewhere between 4 and 5% of the cost of goods to maybe 15% of the cost of goods. So, for people to chase the lower cost goods in international markets, they forgot to calculate in just the logistics of doing business in Korea, doing business in China, doing business in Vietnam, doing business in Indonesia. If you do the proper analysis, you'll find that it's a false economy. Secondarily, and the thing that really drove this thing back to the U.S. market were the tariffs, obviously. And I'm a free market guy, and I dislike tariffs because I also think that they have kind of counterintuitive type negativity to the whole cost structure and the free market analysis. But quite frankly, I have to agree that the tariffs were put in place, particularly with China, were way overdue. And it has driven a lot more manufacturing back to the United States. And I think people now are realizing what I just mentioned. Well, that there were some false economies there. And, actually our cost basis here isn't that bad after all. And, our independence to have the logistics quicker and faster, having things made in Illinois that we used to have made in China, or things made in Iowa that used to be made in China, the acceleration of the supply chain is a real positive. So I think it's come full circle. I'm very bullish on manufacturing in the United States. I think there's a resurgence. I think the fact that, the tariffs triggered the bigger part of that was not a bad thing. So I'm bullish on manufacturing in the United States, and I think we will see a resurgence of more things being made here in this country.
And we here at the Tech Ed Podcast are certainly looking forward to seeing that resurgence as well. Interesting observations around certainly the labor content involved in a manufactured product. And to your point, if it's as low as 4 or 5%, even cutting that number in half doesn't take a tremendous amount of cost out of the overall cost of that product. And also just generates a tremendous amount of complexity in terms of the supply chain, in terms of lead times, in terms of what do you do if something gets short here in the US and it's got a defect, how do you resolve that? So all these challenges that can come along with a global supply chain, we're certainly seeing the effect of those challenges in our economy today. We talk almost every day about the number of container ships that are sitting out in the ocean off of the coast of California, waiting to be unloaded here in the United States. We're seeing the impact of those stretched out supply chains, extended lead times, which is, of course, is now driving additional cost into manufacturing. We're starting to see that, in the retail environment and in the items that we buy to support our families and to live our lives. So with all these current challenges influencing the existing supply chain, Tim, I've got to believe that's going to lead to more manufacturing here in the United States. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely. It's going to have the knock-on effect. Okay, so tariffs really are the wake-up call and to bring things back here. And this, I was in Long Beach 3 or 4 weeks ago, and I started counting the ships back then. 3 or 4 weeks ago, I think I counted 66. Well, now I'm reading that it's over 100. That will have a tremendous knock-on effect to people. I think as we go through the holidays here and people can't get goods, the resurgence of some of the things in the housing market and things like that, there's going to be a great deal of frustration. And I absolutely positively think it's going to drive manufacturing back here to our shores.
We were just having a conversation in a recent episode of the podcast with former Governor Scott Walker. We're going to talk about him in just a moment. But one of the things that he and I talked about, he was talking about folks paying Christmas bills after Christmas. And I said, let's hope we have Christmas bills to pay. We'll see what kind of products we can even purchase as we head into the holidays. It's going to be an interesting time indeed. Let's talk now a little bit about the workforce training, preparing the next generation of the workforce. You and I both know folks. I have them in my own family who were able to spend 30, 40, even 50 years in the same career, in the same job. If you had a role like production line work, assembly, welding, manual machining, and you wanted to, you could stay in a job like that for your entire career. That's way harder to do today than it was then, is it not? We've got all of these changing work environments, changing technologies, advancing technologies in manufacturing. Talk a little bit about your views on an individual employee's obligation to upskill themselves as their skills maybe become a little bit stale in this era of advancing technology.
Well, it's a couple of questions there. I think, let me answer the first part of that. I think that I do believe that there are long-term job opportunities in manufacturing. I think it's morphed though. And I think, when people say, you say that, Wisconsin's still number one in manufacturing on a per capita basis, that's impossible. We don't see any manufacturing. Yes, you do, but you have to go to the industrial parks of Franklin, here in the Milwaukee area, of Franklin, Oak Creek, New Berlin, Waukesha, northern Milwaukee. What's happened is the manufacturing's all morphed into smaller, family-owned or privately held businesses, and there's hundreds of them. And so you don't hear about it, you don't talk about it as much, but there is longevity, I think, in manufacturing jobs in those industrial parks that surround not only Milwaukee, but that exists throughout the state of Wisconsin. So that's number one. Number two, I think, the challenge really is to educate people to know where the jobs are and know where the opportunities are. And that's the big challenge. That's the disconnect. The jobs are there. Everyone talks about the jobs being there. It's hard to connect the young people and or people that are students into finding out where they are. It was a lot easier years and years ago to walk into Bucyrus. People knew Bucyrus. People knew Alice Chalmers. People knew Kearney and Trecker. I mean, there were big companies that were known. They were the destination. Now, if you look at the Oak Creek, the Franklin, the industrial parks, there's hundreds, but they're smaller businesses, and they're not, the names of the businesses aren't that well known. So that there's that disconnect between workers and where the jobs really are.
That's a really, really interesting observation there again. And I guess I never really thought about it. You think, 30, 50 years ago, companies like Bucyrus, like Alice Chalmers, Rockwell had a much bigger manufacturing footprint in the city of Milwaukee and surrounding area than they do today. Still a huge employer here, but not as much manufacturing, direct manufacturing, harness figures. So many of those jobs have been moved to tier one suppliers and moved outside of the more recognizable names. And I guess that really speaks to, in a lot of ways, this whole idea of creating more consortiums, more groups of smaller employers, manufacturers that are advocating on behalf of manufacturing careers. Because you're right, you don't have, maybe your grandfather or your father that worked for one of those iconic names all those years. You don't necessarily have people in your family that are pointing you to those brands. And it's harder to attach the brand, if there's a brand at all, of a contract manufacturer to the jobs that they might have, because you don't necessarily have that connection the way you would to an end use product. So really fascinating observations there, Tim, on this whole idea of upskilling. And as we look at technologies like robotics, automation, some people would call Industry 4.0, smart sensors, smart devices, and this morphing role of technology in the world of manufacturing, talk about the employer's role in providing lifelong learning to their existing workforce. Back in the 1970s, even, we saw small and mid-sized businesses and large manufacturers alike providing sometimes 50 to 100 hours of skills-based training to their employees every year. We've gotten away from that a little bit. Do employers have an obligation to figure out how to train their incumbent workforce?
I think they do. I think, again, this goes back to what I just said, though. That's the challenge. You're talking with smaller employers. You're talking to employers that aren't as connected with, Industry 4.0, that don't really look at the type of mechanization that can happen and the reduction in labor in various, entities that exist out there. That doesn't mean that it can't be done and it shouldn't be done, but it's going to be, I think, at a little bit slower pace than what it would have been, if the big monolithic manufacturing companies were there fueling that. So for an example, the last year before we sold Bucyrus to Caterpillar, we were averaging training costs of $7 to $8 million a year. That was our training costs. And we took it upon ourselves to do that training, and there was another $5 to $6 million we were contributing to try to do what we could to automate certain processes in the plant. Now, we were a $5 billion revenue company that had that type of capability to fund those types of training initiatives and advancements in technology. Again, if you think back what I just said, you got hundreds of smaller mom and pop or privately held small manufacturing entities throughout industrial parks all throughout the Milwaukee area. It's going to be a lot harder to advance that technology. It's going to be a lot harder to convince a guy that's got a smaller manufacturing footprint in the Franklin Industrial Park to spend that money on training. They expect the workers to kind of show up already trained. And that's not the case. It's just not what's happening. We have to figure out how to bridge that disconnect.
Exactly. And bridging that disconnect, I think, is going to be a key part of maintaining a really, really healthy manufacturing sector in the city of Milwaukee and or in surrounding areas in the state of Wisconsin as this technology continues to change. I want to now turn our sights a little bit to some of the philanthropic work that you've done, that Bucyrus has done. I want to talk about your foundation. As we mentioned in the introduction, you're the chairman of the Bucyrus Foundation. I want to start by just sharing a really quick story. 30 years ago now, it's hard to believe it's been 30 years. I was special assistant to Milwaukee County Executive David F. Schultz, who folks in Milwaukee will recall as the county executive back in the late 80s and the early 90s. And one of the things that I was tasked with doing at that time was raising money for an event that he was holding at the Milwaukee County Zoo for about 15,000 veterans and their families. This was in the days of the first Desert Storm. And he asked me to raise money. And one of my first phone calls at that time was to Bucyrus International. And I'm happy to say that company was one of the very first to step up with a significant investment in that event, supporting our region and our state's veterans, supporting all the great things that they did to protect our freedom back then and obviously still do today. So Bucyrus, one of the very first companies to step up and support that organization. Bucyrus International and now your foundation really has an incredible spirit and history of philanthropy in the city of Milwaukee and around the state of Wisconsin. Tell us now how you're living that out through the Bucyrus Foundation.
Well, a couple of things. I think one large initiative that you probably read about is that we have donated $10 million to the city of South Milwaukee, $1 million a year over the next 10 years. And that was purposeful for one very good reason. Bucyrus, as it existed for over 100 years in South Milwaukee, Wisconsin, will never exist again in South Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And as I just mentioned, these big monolithic companies and these big plants are a thing of the past. I was in the vehicle business with Rev for 6 years. All the huge monolithic plants in Detroit are gone. It's all being morphed into smaller type manufacturing companies. So I'm working with the city of South Milwaukee to help them in many respects, refigure how that city can move forward without Bucyrus. We employed a lot of people over 100 years there. That's not going to happen. So we want to be part of helping South Milwaukee basically reform how their economy can be very fruitful going forward. And that was the purpose of that particular grant. And it's not specific to manufacturing necessarily, although we're helping with the manufacturing scope that is happening still in South Milwaukee, but on a smaller scale. Again, smaller companies are moving into our old campus and taking up pieces of the buildings, which is good. But there's got to be more. There's got to be a master plan to what the city is going to look like, 10 years from now. The other part that we're focused on, and we are focused on manufacturing, and we've got some things that we're working on right now at the foundation that we'll be announcing very soon, that we hope will take our efforts to really drive manufacturing and the health of manufacturing going forward in the future. And we plan to roll those things out here in the next month or two.
Can't wait to hear about that. Obviously, here at the Tech Ed Podcast, huge fans of manufacturing and anybody who's doing things economically, financially, or otherwise to support the next generation of the workforce to support manufacturing in general, something we're hugely supportive of. We'll look for those announcements, and thanks for giving us a little bit of a foretaste, if you will, of some of the things that you've got on the radar coming up here, Tim. You mentioned this $10 million gift that you're making to the town of South Milwaukee, $1 million a year over the course of 10 years. You just shared with us a little bit of the logic behind doing that, which makes tremendous sense. And obviously great credit to your foundation for that incredible investment. A good $2 million of this is being directed at the South Milwaukee School District and primarily focused on athletics and music to the ears of the Tech Ed podcast, STEM and manufacturing education. So as you know, Tech Ed is evolving to include more authentic manufacturing technology, a more focus on advanced manufacturing, what many call Industry 4.0. We've already used that term a few times here today. How much influence will the foundation have over how that grant is invested? What types of technologies, what types of learning experiences for the students?
Very much involved. And, I've met with the school superintendent now 3 times already to talk about exactly how we'd like to see that money spent in the area of CTE and how that's evolving and what can happen. It's amazing. People ask me all the time how I got involved in manufacturing. I said, well, when I was a kid, we called it industrial arts or shop. Every high school had it.
I did.
Every high school.
Yep.
Over time, it disappeared. Well, ironically enough, and that's one thing the foundation's getting several requests in right now, there are high schools and school districts coming to us saying they want to reinstitute that type of curriculum into the high schools. It disappeared. Can you imagine? It just went away. Because everyone, somewhere back in the 1980s, when I did the research for the governor back in 2012, sometime during Ronald Reagan's administration, the American dream shifted from a good paying job to a 4-year degree. And we could never put our finger on exactly how that happened. But then, the curriculums in the schools changed. So we want to really make South Milwaukee and the school district there a model for a well-balanced education where, things like I grew up and you grew up with, with industrial arts and shop classes and that type of thing, kids are exposed to that. When 70%, this is an amazing statistic, when 70% of the jobs in Milwaukee and Wisconsin do not require a 4-year degree, quite frankly, most of them don't require a post-secondary degree. They require some training, but not necessarily a post-secondary degree. But yet, the focus is on a 4-year education in a university. There's a complete disconnect there. So we want to try to at least use, South Milwaukee as a test case for what a well-balanced approach to high school curriculum should be.
A well-balanced approach. And that's certainly, again, great news here at the Tech Ed podcast, thinking about the great opportunities in STEM, in manufacturing. Your note that 70% of the jobs in the state of Wisconsin don't require a college degree, a 4-year degree. Many of them don't require anything post-high school. Really, really fascinating. It shows you where the opportunities are, almost regardless of your education background. I always point to a study that was done a few years back, Tim, by Skills USA and the Manufacturing Institute. They interviewed 23,000 young people, and there were people that had graduated from high school, moved on with their, whatever came after high school. And they said, what influenced your career pathway? And in all of the regular expected things are on the list. It's parents, it's opportunities in, what they've seen in social media, what their parents' friends are doing, what their friends' parents are doing, maybe what a career advisor, an academic advisor told them they should think about. But the number one thing on that list, when they did this study of these 23,000 young people, number one influencer, and it was 3 times greater than anything else, was their own experiences and their own interests as they were going through middle school and high school. And to your point, somewhere around, 10, 15, 20 years ago, we decimated technical education, in not just in the state of Wisconsin, but all over the country. And now we wonder why we don't have young people interested in manufacturing careers. It's because they're not being influenced in ways that show them what rewarding and amazing careers they can have. I saw them for all my years in manufacturing. I tell people it's still the place where you can start out sweeping the floor and end up running the company or pause anywhere along the way and have a really amazing, sustaining, interesting, secure career in the world of manufacturing. And it all comes back to, in so many ways, getting young people interested in these careers while they're in middle school and high school. So to that point, you did mention that you plan to have quite a bit of influence over the programs that are taking place at South Milwaukee High School, that you've had several meetings with the superintendent. Can you expand a little bit on what you think an ideal K-12 program should look like?
Well, it's got to be well balanced. If 70% of the jobs do not require a four-year degree, and most of them not a post-secondary degree, prepare them for those. We're not. And so if you look at South Milwaukee, and this is something we've learned too through some of the research I did when I was working for Governor Walker, is people don't travel far from where they grow up. It's just, we think that, Americans are very transient and we move all over the place. That's just not really true for the vast majority of the people. So if you're the school district of South Milwaukee, or the school district in Northern Milwaukee or Mequon or wherever, what are the demographics like? What are the jobs like in that immediate geographic area? Because that's a microcosm, really, of not only Milwaukee, but the state of Wisconsin and the upper Midwest. And figure out what those jobs are. Figure out what the job needs are and put that into the curriculum for the schools, for the high schools. And let the kids know really early on where the jobs are, what their interests might be, what those jobs are going to pay. When we did the research again, back in 2012, the jobs that are available for kids just walking out of high school are actually paying more than kids that are graduating with four-year degrees. And I think if kids understood that when they were freshmen in high school, that, hey, I could be a plumber and I can make $75,000 a year, my first year or two, or maybe it's $50,000 a year or $55,000 a year as a welder, as a beginning welder. But yet, if I go to get a four-year degree on one of the UW campuses, I come out and my average, this is true, the average pay was around $40,000. So you're talking about pay scales that were 30 to 50% more than a four-year degree student. If kids walk into high school and they know that, they'll start making the right choices.
You had so many different statistics and numbers in that last answer. It's fascinating to just listen to all that. We think about the starting salaries for folks entering the world of manufacturing. And, we hear examples of young people taking classes in robotics and robot programming, for instance, and graduating from high school, going to work in manufacturing, and their jobs that start at $60,000, $70,000 a year. They're not right for everybody. I mean, we should make sure that students recognize what their options are. But wow, starting right out of high school with a job like that, you're not incurring all of that college debt that oftentimes comes along with a four-year degree. And these are jobs where we tell students you're not choosing your lifelong career. These are starting points, and you can go so many different directions. You can start out programming a robot, end up running a manufacturing company, being a supervisor of a department in manufacturing. And a lot of times, in fact, almost always, your employer will pay you to continue your education. And so you're not choosing a lifelong career. You're choosing an option. You're choosing a pathway that can lead to so many amazing things. And I think we're seeing more and more of that as organizations like the Bucyrus Foundation and private employers are getting more involved in the whole world of education. We've got many Wisconsin employers like Sargento, Metalcraft in Mayville, Ashley Furniture. These are companies that have made literally seven-figure contributions and investments to advanced manufacturing technical education programs. One of the things, and I've been involved in a lot of these boards and a lot of the organizations that have helped put these consortiums together, the educators are always interested in how data-driven the employers are. They really want results. They receive the grant, or the educator receives the funding up front. But, come a year or two down the road, employers are asking, okay, how many young people have you inspired toward careers in advanced manufacturing? How many students have earned third-party certifications in advanced manufacturing endeavors? I think this comes back to the whole culture of what gets measured improves. We talk about that all the time in manufacturing. You want to improve something, start by measuring it. And once you're measuring it, gathering data, it gets better. And that culture pervades manufacturing. What outcomes, Tim, would you say employers and other donors expect from the investments they make in the future of STEM and technical education?
You actually named it. I think, people are looking for results. I mean, anyone's willing to put the money up, but they want to see the results coming out of it. And it's always been a challenge. It's always been a challenge for the technical, schools throughout the state to be able to kind of show those types of results. It's challenging. But manufacturers, I think, will step up if they do see that the results will be what they're funding. And I think by and large, you have to take a leap of faith. By and large, you do get the results. And that's why you have to make those investments.
So manufacturers will step up when they see the opportunity, when they see an organization, a school district, a technical college, what have you, that's interested in getting more and more young people excited about these careers in manufacturing and willing to measure results. The whole point of this is that the partnership don't necessarily end and shouldn't end with the donation of capital, cash, equipment, whatever it is. What should both the donor organization and the school do once that investment is made to strengthen and leverage the partnership for the benefit of all of them, especially their communities and their students?
Well, continue the effort of dialogue and making sure that the curriculums that are matching the jobs that are out there. To your point, things move in the industries that we're trying to, create workers for. And if you don't stay on top of that and literally on a regular basis, change the approach, tweak the approach. And sometimes it's not a wholesale change, but it's tweaking the approach to make sure you're pinpointing, sharpshooting, the jobs that are out there in that immediate area. You're going to lose out. But if you can create that public-private partnership and make sure you're monitoring this on a regular basis, it really can and it does work.
We've seen when we put together amazing partnerships between private employers, between private foundations with an interest in manufacturing, and forward-thinking educators who are willing to be held accountable, you can do some really, really incredible things. So Tim Sullivan, who is the chairman of the Bucyrus Foundation, is our guest here today on the Tech Ed Podcast, former chief executive of Bucyrus International. Tim, one of the things that we hear when we talk to K-12 districts, and in full disclosure, this is actually a question that came from a friend of mine who is a CTE coordinator. He said, a lot of times in the world of CTE, we get individual employers pulling at us to implement learning around their specific discipline of manufacturing or STEM or the skilled trades and so on, whether that's construction or engineering or automotive, even getting into things like information technology, artificial intelligence, Industry 4.0. They all have their own flavor of manufacturing. They all want to see that taught at the specific school. So we know that schools have limited budgets and staffing shortages, especially in the area of CTE, and schools can't do it all. For that CTE director and for any individual involved in technical education in the state of Wisconsin, what advice would you give to school administrators regarding which areas of technology and engineering they should be prioritizing as investments in their program?
Well, I think the person you talked to hit the nail on the head, and I mentioned that previously. You need to develop the public-private partnerships. And if there's a business in a specific geographic area that really plans to tap into, the kids that are going through high school and they want a program kind of tailored more towards what their needs are, bring some money to the table. And I think the CTE directors and the administrators and the school boards will look kindly on the fact that public and private partnerships can work. But there's no free ride necessarily. If I'm making a certain product and I have a certain skill set I require, well, Mr. Educator, you got to really, funnel me those people. Well, I need to step up too. I mean, it's got to be a partnership. And I think it works really well when I think the companies that have specific needs are willing to partner with, the high schools and the CTE programs to kind of drive those types of things. That's exactly what we want to do with South Milwaukee. We want to, have them concentrate in their immediate geographic area, partner up with companies, we'll help facilitate that as a foundation, but they have to develop those public-private relationships. And if you do that, now you've created that pipeline that you need, and it all works hand in glove that way.
And it's easier than a lot of people think. One of the things we find in the world of education is sometimes they're a little bit intimidating to sit down with leaders of manufacturing companies because they don't speak the same language per se. They don't necessarily understand manufacturing. And we see the same thing from manufacturers where you walk into a group of educators that they speak a different language too. I came over to the world of education 5 or 6 years ago from the world of manufacturing. And there's a whole different language over here that I didn't even know existed. And so we tell people, check the agendas at the door, admit that you don't speak each other's language, get the discussions going. And then I think you make a really, really good point for employers that want to influence what's being taught in those CTE programs. A few years ago, I actually wrote a magazine column for Gardner Media about how industrial employers can build better relationships with their districts. And the final item on that list was put your money where your mouth is. And if you're willing to invest in those programs, without question, you're going to have additional influence over what gets taught and how they get morphed, and you should, right? I mean, that's where the jobs are. If the jobs in your local community are reflected in the programs in the schools, going back to the point we made a while ago, if your own interests and experiences in middle school and high school are what dictate your career choices, let's give young people those experiences while they're in middle school and high school, and employers can step up and invest time and information and their financial resources in the future of those programs. So great advice, both for that CTE director and for employers. Another observation, this one we often hear from employers, is about the convergence that's taking place in the world of manufacturing. And that convergence is between what we call OT and IT, operations technology, and information technology. This is especially true in organizations that are leveraging Industry 4.0 and advanced manufacturing. So we've seen companies, one example here in Wisconsin is Kohler. They were on a webinar not too long ago talking about how they have a whole program for their IT employees learning operations technology. You know, they were pretty blunt about the fact that their IT folks are getting pulled into onto the shop floor as equipment becomes more and more connected, as data becomes more and more important in manufacturing, and gathering it in real time is now something that we can do. And so they're trying to figure out, how do we train our IT teams around operations technology? Is it important, Tim, for K-12 districts to inspire non-traditional tech ed students? We talk about shop, we talk about the world of industrial arts in our day, and it was kind of a specific group of students that kind of made their way through those programs. Now we have students that might be interested in computer science, math, and even art, who could have a huge opportunity in the world of manufacturing. Should we be attracting those toward tech ed coursework? And if so, how do we do that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I'll give you the best example I can think of. Have you ever seen or been to an Amazon warehouse?
I have.
Yeah. Now, you talk about IT, you talk about computerization of warehousing, and that was not done. That was not done without a tremendous amount of input from IT. And they're constantly trying to improve that whole approach. And as we know, Amazon and all the rest of the stuff is just growing exponentially, and it's going to continue to do that. So that's the prime example of where IT marries up with a function that's the downstream function of manufacturing. On the upstream function, we did have IT very much involved in our manufacturing processes, because a lot of the machine tools that are used today, it's a computer controlled machine tool. You set these things up, program them, and they literally run by themselves. And then you figure out, okay, how can we even automate that system better? We had a very robust number of IT people working on how can we automate our welding processes. So we had a very strong integration of IT into manufacturing, and that's the future. That's where it's going to go, because we have a shortage of labor in manufacturing. So I guess the silver lining in the fact that we've got somewhat of a labor shortage and a skills gap, it's going to force more and more into automation and IT solutions to the manufacturing processes. And I think if young adults are exposed to those types of opportunities, it's not all creating websites. I mean, there's some really strong, good stuff out there that they can make some really good money at in the manufacturing areas with IT.
Yeah, especially for those students that have a hands-on kinesthetic nature to them as well. So if you love technology, if you love computer science, but you also like to build things, to make things. I had one of my kids spend a good several months working in manufacturing a couple of years ago, and people would say, well, did you want him to work in manufacturing so that he knew that he could go find other opportunities and that he didn't want to have a job working on a shop floor his whole life? And I said, that's exactly the opposite of why I did it. I wanted him to see the amazing opportunities that exist in manufacturing. I wanted him to have that pride that goes along with looking over your shoulder at the end of the day and saying, I made that. I wanted him to work around the kinds of people that work in manufacturing shop floors across America, the people that I worked with for 23 years, who are just amazing people, and wanted him to have all those experiences. So you get all of that. Plus, with this advancing technology in the world of manufacturing, you really can come from all these different disciplines. If you have an interest in computer science, an interest in data analytics, an interest in math, those kinds of opportunities are alive and well in the world of manufacturing in a huge way. So we've had just a great conversation here with Tim Sullivan. I'm going to ask one final question, Tim, and it's a question we ask every single guest here on the Tech Ed podcast. And that is, if you could give one piece of advice to a student who is a sophomore in high school as they consider their future pathway, what would that piece of advice be?
My piece of advice would be that an American success story is a good paying job, not a 4-year degree. Do not concentrate on only college prep. Look at your options. Look at what else is out there. Every kid that I talk to, I say, hey, 70% of the jobs do not require a four-year degree. The statistic that just blew me away back in 2012 was that year we had 91,000 students enrolled in our technical colleges, our 16 campuses across the state, 91,000. How many of those do you think already had a four-year degree? 38,000. 38,000 young individuals that had a four-year degree were back in the technical colleges because of one very important thing. They couldn't get a job. They couldn't find a job. They needed to develop a skill to get a job. So I tell them, look, make your choices wisely. Go with the statistics. They're very clear. 70% of the jobs that are available out there and some of the best paying jobs do not require a four-year degree.
So an American success story is a good paying job. That is absolutely perfect. Tim Sullivan, I've long admired your wisdom, your intellect, and your candor. You're never shy about sharing exactly what you think, and we admire that as well. Thanks so much for being with us today.
My pleasure again. Thanks for inviting me.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Tech Ed Podcast. If you haven't already, subscribe, leave a review, and if you liked this episode, share it with a friend. New episodes launch every Tuesday, so listen in next week.